Dear friends, when the chairman came up here and whispered to us, I think you ought to know that he said to Dr. Pereira, "You have 2 sentences." And then he turned to me and he said, "You have 1." Now I'm going to try to stay within that severe time limit and present to you in this bit of our session the life of Alain Locke, dawn-minded in a twilight age. It is not to be suggested or asserted that Dr. Alain Locke can be likened to the spiritual brilliance and distinctive station of our hand of the cause, Louis Gregory. This discussion on Dr. Locke, an eminent scholar whose life was touched by the Baha'i faith and whose life affords us some patterns of the use of education toward Baha'i objectives, is brought to you solely in that spirit for what it says about the uses of education and for what it brings to mind on the present teaching opportunities his life affords us today. If education is to serve its purpose, it must be for the individual a developing and disciplining procedure. You may have a certificate, you may have paid all your school fees, and you may be introduced as this, that, or the other. But if education has not done certain things for you, which you can use in any field of human endeavor, then you have missed out on the procedure. Education must provide training for spiritual and intellectual skills. It must enable us to analyze and to evaluate human experiences and to draw from them some truth and some reality. It must accelerate in us motivation to use knowledge productively. There is nothing so sad as a wise fool. It must lead us away from isolation and self-aggrandizement to the world of action where one lives and thinks creatively to advance the noble arts of civilization. I am reminded in a passage from the letters of Abdul-Baha, the great teacher of the faith, where he said, "I desire the Baha'is to become distinguished. I desire the Baha'is to contribute to the useful arts of civilization and its graces." And then he went on to talk about the importance of science, the importance of all the things that are related to it. And I mentioned to you Alain Locke's life this afternoon because I think his life is a kind of demonstration of the high standards of education. Almost 30 years have passed since Alain Locke's death in 1954, and yet time has enhanced his stature. At Howard University, where he served as an educating force, revising curriculum, starting departments for many years, an annual memorial lecture is held in a hall which bears his name. In scholarly magazines and periodicals, appraisals of his theories and writings still appear. And recently, the National Endowment for the Humanities co-sponsored with Atlanta University's Center for African American Studies a seminar on the contributions of Alain Locke in philosophy, in creative arts, and in sociology. These seminar lectures have been published by Louisiana State University in a book that is entitled Alain Locke, Reflections on a Modern Renaissance Man. So it is that the influence of this man and his thought is still a measurable force in our society. One of the editors of the book, head of the philosophy department of the University of Tennessee, gives this comment on Alain Locke. He remains one of the most significant black figures of the 20th century. He was a highly original and productive thinker. He deserves to be studied for his contributions to philosophy, education, and culture, because his ideas have relevance for decades and may aid us to a broader understanding of changes of our times, which do indeed go beyond race and become a part of the maturing development of human beings and human civilization. Now, with that in mind, let us look at the life of Alain Locke and how it started. He was born and lived and studied in a climate where racial prejudice, national insularities, and cultural taboos imposed many restrictions on individuals and groups, so that freedom of opportunity and expression were often missing from his life. And yet, some inner gift of spirit enabled him to overcome the negative forces of his environment. He had that drive and that motivation for excellence. He, in completing his education, became a graduate of Harvard University, taking his PhD from the Department of Philosophy in 1918. How many black students were there in Harvard at that time? Not many. During that same year, he won a Rhodes Scholarship, and this is a cherished ambition in the academic world. He became the first American black to receive this distinction, the first American black Rhodes Scholar. With this distinction, he studied at Oxford College in England and at the University of Berlin, specializing in philosophy. It was during this period that he became interested in the subject of values and imperatives that the values produce in human beings. And he began to do a great deal of writing and research on to what extent our culture, our environment, and our associations affect our values. At the end of his period of studies abroad, he returned to the States and spent 6 months in the South. Now, he knew what the South was all about, but he came back down here. Here he had encounters with racial prejudice and bigotry again. But instead of embittering him, he didn't burn down any buildings or tear up any textbooks. He used that adverse experience. He analyzed it, he drew the truth from it, and he set about to use it. For the rest of his life, he devoted himself to analysis, interpretation, and recognition of the cultural achievements of American blacks. The very things which were the source of ridicule and degradation, he turned with his effort, his study, and his creativeness into things which could become a source of learning and admiration. He did this with a commitment to the principle of attaining a universal perspective of human achievement. He wanted to see how, among oppressed peoples, art, music, poetry serve as tools for survival, and what they bring out from the soul of the person who is under pressure that can be studied, admired, and likened to all human experience. Returning east from that adventure in the South, he initiated the Harlem Renaissance movement. And Dr. Billingsley quoted an impressive poem from one of the artists, one of the poets, who was brought out by the Renaissance movement. That movement brought forth excellence in creative writing and art from American blacks, which enabled them to achieve both national and international acclaim. Alain Locke became the first major art critic and commentator on African and American art. He helped to establish art departments at Howard University and in many other black institutions, not only for artistic reasons, but because he believed that the knowledge of cultural, physiological, and sociological understanding of a people is made possible through their art, through their creative expression. And that when we get to this point of appreciation, we learn more about all humanity. Thus, he helped countless human beings to understand themselves and each other and pass beyond the reactions of bitterness and hostility in dealing with oppression and with adverse experiences. In addition to his contributions to Afro-American culture and the recognition of it, Locke was no mere talker and thinker. He was a doer, a man of action. He laid the foundation for a new social and racial awareness among blacks and whites. He was co-founder with the eminent Dr. Kelly Miller of Howard University of a national council to coordinate activity in race relations. From this one man's effort, a mushrooming of interest and activity began. He contributed articles to outstanding magazines, including the American Scholar, Progressive Education, the Survey Graphic, the Southern Workman, Crisis Magazine, The Nation, and even wrote articles for the Encyclopedia Britannica. Alain Locke, thus, was both a scholar and an activist. He did not confine himself to words. He was committed to social reform and to realism. And it is interesting, friends, that he never favored violence as a tactic. nor was it a part of his concept of being militant. His view was that culture could become ammunition in the battle for racial survival and progress. And he sought to have American blacks recognized as legitimate contributors to American culture and world culture. Now, all the while, he was promoting creativity and recognition of art and culture that was black. He was pursuing his writing on the theory of values. Time does not permit me to go into a discussion of that theory, but suffice it to say that his writings as a philosopher were recognized by such American philosophers as John Dewey, Raymond Seelers, Northrop, and McKeon, who included several of his dissertations in their publication. And these scholars were the organizers of a yearly conference on science, philosophy, today, and tomorrow in America. He was also included, I beg your pardon, they were organizers of a conference on science, philosophy, and religion. And Locke was also included in anthologies of American philosophy today and tomorrow, which were the works of Sidney Hook and Horace Callan. In the presentation of problems arising from attempts to establish a principle of rightness or wrongness for values, Locke came upon a Baha'i concept. He wrote that the solution to conflicting values which come from different backgrounds and ideas might lie in assigning a positive value to any effort which arrived at overcoming conflicts in human relations. That value is a good value. And assigning a negative value to any effort aimed at erecting stronger barriers between people of different interests and desires. One of the commentators on Locke's philosophy of values, a Dr. William Harvey, said that his theories were a continuous effort to direct the collective energies of all people toward a transcendental approach to interaction in which differences of race, culture, and values and ideas are respected and appreciated. For he believed that human beings can constitute a world order. Does that sound familiar to you? A world order that draws its strength from the implicit similarities of human experience. Locke, he said, contributed a vision and an ideal which might lead to the kind of world in which weapons are replaced by reason. Now, in my last part of the sentence, I still have 5 minutes. I want to talk about Alain Locke's contact with the Baha'i faith. It dated from the 20s when he was in Washington and very active in Howard University. He made several appearances for Baha'i programs and contributed several articles to the publication, The Baha'i World. He visited the World Center of the Baha'i Faith in Haifa during the period of the first Guardian of the Faith and recorded his impressions in an article entitled Impressions of Haifa. This article is published in Baha'i World. It gives us yet another view of a scholarly intellect, disclosing a man who is humbled by the spirit of the holy places and expressing his deeply felt reaction. He wrote, "Whether Baha'i or non-Baha'i, Haifa makes pilgrims of all who visit her. There is a new light in the world, and there must be a new day. The death of the greatest of the teachers is the release of their spirit in the world and the responsible legacy of their example, which is bequeathed to posterity." In the same article, Locke mentioned his admiration for the household of the guardian of the Baha'i faith, and in mentioning it gave us an understanding of what a new perspective might do for the great issues of labor. He saw in the guardian's household a splendid example of the division of labor with a unity of heart. Now think about that for a minute. He wrote, "I have never seen the necessary subordination of organized service so full of a sense of dignity and essential equality. In the spirit of such devoted cooperation and cheerful subordination, there is a potential solution of those great problems of caste and class which today so affect human society. Labor is dignified through the consciousness of its place and worth to the general scene. No Baha'i worker, however humble, seems unconscious of the dignity and meaning of the whole plan to which his labor is contributed." Friends, isn't that a penetrating sight and a beautiful comment? A profound observation to help us to new values and attitudes about the grades and types of labor and human beings who perform them. In another article written for Baha'i World, Dr. Locke wrote on unity and diversity. And are you coming to stop me? He pointed out that universality was the spirit of our age. And he said, as if writing to the Baha'is, and it is this I want to leave with you, "I have one humble suggestion. We must take pains to learn and speak a language which the practical-minded understand. The message must be translated into terms and ideas and practical issues of the present world. Now is the time for a worldwide, confident, determined offensive on the part of the Baha'is, a peaceful presentation of the basic principles of the faith on brotherhood." And the last quotation from which I took the title of this talk is from an article which he wrote for the Baha'is at a time when the world was just facing the results of the Great Depression, and the country was full of conflict and confusion. He said, "As the clouds darken over our chaotic world, all of us, even those who still cherish the dream and hope of a new world order of peace, righteousness, and justice, must face the question of where to focus our expectations, where to orient our hopes. If we And he's speaking of Baha'is now. He didn't say you, so he must have included himself. If we fall victim to the twilight mood, are we not spiritual traitors to the universal ideal? Must we not, as Baha'is, embrace our principles more positively, more realistically, and point everywhere possible our assertion of the teachings with a direct challenge? And then he closed with this beautiful statement: we must be dawn-minded in a twilight age. Ours is the occasion and opportunity to convince many who are skeptical because they could not see the impending failure of an old world order, who are now in a questioning and thoroughly disillusioned mood. Thus, I have tried to give you Alain Locke as a scholar, an activist who sought to use education with passion, and as a man touched by the ideals and principles of the Baha'i faith. If we think of him, certainly we can be dawn-minded in a twilight age. Thank you.